Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Jamie Weinstein Show. My guest today needs no introduction. And in fact, if he needs an introduction, then you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. My guest is Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, and we have quite a lively conversation. We get into all the issues you would imagine, including impeachment, his personal impressions of Donald Trump up close, and everything in between, his influences, foreign policy, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. As I said, it's lively. I wouldn't say it gets heated. I think that's too strong of a word, but we certainly do have lively discussion at points. But that's all I can say about it. I think you will be happy you listened after you have. As I always ask, please go to iTunes and rate the show if you enjoy the episodes we put out. Give us a 5-star review. Please continue to interact with the show. Go to Twitter and tweet at me at Jamie_Weinstein or email at me at jamieweinstein.com. Let me know what guests you'd like to be on the show and what questions you'd like me to ask guests that I announce will be on the show. Sometimes I ask those. This episode I did not, but I often do. So all interaction is good interaction. So without further ado, I recorded this episode Thursday, December 12th at Ted Cruz's Washington, D.C. office. Enjoy. Here is Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, thank you for joining the Jamie Weinstein Show.
Jamie, good to be with you.
I'd like to begin where I have begun with most of my guests recently. We are nearing 3 years into the Trump administration. Has anything surprised you?
Sure. I'm surprised by how much we've gotten accomplished. Mm-hmm. I think the record of successes over the last 3 years is nothing short of astonishing. You look on the economic front, the tax bill passing the biggest tax cut in a generation, repealing hundreds of job-killing regulations. You look at the results that we're seeing, the lowest unemployment in 50 years, lowest African-American unemployment ever recorded, lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded, wages rising across the country, poverty falling, number of Americans on food stamps falling over 6 million. I mean, these are incredible economic results. I think on foreign policy, we have seen dramatic improvements. I think we are standing once again by our friends and allies. Things like moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. That was a big, big deal, something I urged the president vigorously to do, but he demonstrated a lot of courage following through and moving the embassy over the objections of both his State Department and Defense Department. Things like pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, a big, big deal, the most important national security decision of the last 3 years. Once again, both state and defense opposed it. Once again, I urged the president to do it, and he had the courage to make that decision. We're in the middle of the biggest military rebuild since Ronald Reagan. He's nominated, and we've confirmed over 160 new federal judges, including this week the 50th Court of Appeals judge. All of those are big, big deals, and the magnitude of the victories that we have won working together, I think that is a very happy and pleasant surprise.
I want to get into some of those in a little bit. Many of my listeners haven't had the opportunity to meet the president. You obviously have. You've worked with him. What have you gleaned by being up and close and personal with him, about him, his character, what people can understand about him that they might not know from just watching him on television?
You know, Donald Trump in person is very much what you see on TV. I think a lot of people assume that Trump at a rally, Trump unfiltered, that must be somehow kind of a show. It's not. That's exactly how he is sitting in the Oval Office. That's how he is sitting at a table. He can be funny at times. He can discuss a whole host of issues in a very short period of time. He can make decisions very quickly. He can be volatile. I viewed the last 3 years, one of the most important jobs that I've had is working very, very closely with the president and trying to encourage the president and the administration to move in a positive direction and not a negative direction. Mm-hmm. I've been gratified that on a great many issues he's been listening to me, not on everything, and I don't prevail on every policy dispute, but on a lot of issues, the president has agreed with me, has agreed with the council of others, and I think that has helped produce the incredible record of successes we've seen in the last 3 years.
Senator, even your critics will say that you have a very great intellect. You're very smart. Are you impressed by the president's intellect?
I'm impressed by his backbone, by his willingness to
but
make
not his
hard decisions. If you look at, all right, let's take something like moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That's a good example. As you know, presidents of both parties, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama,
It's true.
all promised to move the embassy. And they all broke that promise, Democrats and Republicans. I've heard quite a few people say, if you look at the 2016 presidential field, that most of the Republicans running would not have moved the embassy for the same reason that the previous presidents had. I campaigned on moving the embassy. That was a promise, if I'd have won, that we would have started on day one. And Trump.
So you would have done it as well.
Absolutely.
So you have what you would say is backbone and intellect. You said the president has backbone. Do you think?
I'll let you speak to that. What I will say is he has demonstrated backbone and courage in a way that is unusual and important, and I've been gratified by that. Look, moving the embassy, you had both the State Department and Defense Department arguing passionately against it. Identical battle lines on withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. State and defense were telling Mr. President, don't do this, this is a mistake. They were wrong, but he had the courage to do it. And I think there are unfortunately a lot of Republicans that if they'd been sitting in that same chair would have blinked and wouldn't have made those decisions.
Senator, one of the qualities you also have that too few, I think, of your colleagues do, which is praiseworthy, is that you're willing to sit down with people of all ideological stripes. In fact, I was just listening to the podcast this morning that you did with Chris Hayes a few months ago in Texas, and I was struck by one quote you gave, and I want to read it back to you and get your thoughts. You said, "Trump at a fundamental level is not complicated to figure out. He likes people who praise him, and he hates people who criticize him. If Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi had come in and said, 'Mr. President, let's work with you,' I actually shudder to think what would have happened to the country."
Yeah.
Isn't that an indictment, in a way, of the president, that all you have to do is praise him in order to get policy initiatives achieved?
Look, I think there are a lot of people who prefer people who are nice to them to people who are mean to them.
Yeah.
In this crazy environment we're in, things are elevated even more. I think the nastiness with which Schumer and Pelosi and congressional Democrats have treated Trump, I think that surprised him. I don't think he expected that sort of vicious, unrelenting hatred. Now, listen, I think Pelosi and Schumer are responding to the rage in their base. The far left hates Donald Trump. And Pelosi and Schumer are channeling that, but it has, ironically, a very positive impact for the country because they're so nasty that I think it has driven President Trump in a more conservative direction. And I've been grateful for that. I think we've gotten better policy because they've been so nasty that he has not... they haven't been willing to work with him, and it's driven Trump in a better policy direction.
It strikes me, though, that prescription of his personality is not unnoticed by some of America's adversaries abroad.
Sure.
Have you seen in any instance where foreign leaders, by praising Donald Trump, have gotten things that traditional Republicans would not want to give?
Not necessarily. And listen, it is not a new phenomenon that foreign leaders would want to kiss the ass of the American president.
Right, but it is a different phenomenon that, as you said in that quote, that the president will want to... You shuddered at the thought of people praising him, what he might do, what concessions he might give.
Look, there's a contrast. When you look at foreign policy, I haven't agreed with all the foreign policy decisions of the Trump administration. But I actually think the substance of the decisions has been quite strong. Let's take something like Russia. Look, I I don't like some of the language that President Trump has used in the past regarding Putin. I think Putin is a KGB thug. He is not America's friend. President Trump has been less willing to use language like that. I wish he were more willing to call Russia out rhetorically. That being said, I do think there's an irony that the policies that have actually been implemented in the last 3 years, let's take on Russia, have been stronger against Russia than certainly Obama's were over 8 years. Let's take an example this week. So I just finished speaking on the Senate floor about a big bipartisan victory on Russia, which is passing of my legislation, sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Nord Stream 2, as you know, is a gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. It's in the final stages of construction. If it is completed, it would generate billions of dollars for Putin that Russia would use for military expansionism and aggressiveness. I introduced targeted bipartisan sanctions, very narrowly focused like a scalpel directed at the ships that lay the deep sea pipeline. And that legislation has now been incorporated in the National Defense Authorization Act, passed the House yesterday, will pass the Senate in the next couple of days, and the President will sign into law. Passing my legislation on Nord Stream 2 sanctions is a huge victory for American national security. It's a huge victory for Europe, for Ukraine, and it's a huge blow to Putin and Russian military aggressiveness. So,
conversely, though, do you fear, for instance, that President's phone call with Erdogan of Turkey has made him make actions because perhaps he's being praised by Erdogan on the phone that he otherwise would should not have made in a normal national security process?
You know, it's interesting, and I'm glad you brought that example up. As you know, Erdogan was in the United States just a couple of weeks ago. And he came to D.C., and I met with Erdogan, with President Trump in the Oval Office. And it was an interesting meeting. I got to say, it was a unique meeting, for me at least, with a foreign head of state. It was unlike any other meeting I've had with a foreign head of state. You had President Trump, you had Erdogan, and you had 5 senators. Jim Risch, Lindsey Graham, Joni Ernst, Rick Scott, and myself. What was unusual about the meeting, it was about an hour and a half long. It was a long meeting. In the course of the hour and a half, I would say President Trump spoke maybe 5-10 minutes. He spoke very little, which is unusual. In most meetings with the president, he speaks a lot. But what he did in this meeting is he largely stayed silent and let the 5 senators speak. And we engaged vigorously with Erdogan. I leaned in hard with Erdogan, and I said, look, Turkey is an ally, a NATO ally. That relationship is important to the United States. But you need to understand there are also significant concerns that the U.S. Congress has with Turkey right now. And the 2 that I highlighted is Turkey has recently purchased the Russian S-400 missile defense system. And I said that system is utterly incompatible with continuing to purchase American-made F-35 fighter jets. Why? The S-400 is designed to try to shoot the F-35 out of the sky. And so I told Erdogan, if you keep the S-400, you ain't getting F-35s. If you want F-35s, you got to get rid of the S-400. And that was echoed by the other 4 senators there.
But not the president.
Let me pause that for a second. Let me make the second point and then loop back to the president. So I'm not avoiding it, but let me finish. The second point I made that I think was very important for Erdogan to hear is I said, listen, Turkey cannot engage in aggressive military action against the Kurds. The Kurds have been our allies. They have stood with America. They have risked their lives. Many of them have given their lives fighting alongside America. And we're not going to stand by while Turkey attempts to slaughter the Kurds. Look, neither of these messages did Erdogan like hearing, and particularly on the latter message, Erdogan engaged vigorously. We had some real fireworks on that point.
Over what from understanding what he thought the Kurds were terrorists and not. But
my point on this that was
but
interesting.
can I just jump in there real quickly? But I mean, you're arguing over something kind of a fait accompli. The president already allowed, Erdogan to go into that territory, to the Syrian north.
My point, at least, was less focused on territory and more focused on not killing people. What was interesting about the president, as I said, I haven't seen this happen in other meetings, but we were essentially playing bad cop. And I think to some extent, and look, before the meeting, the five of us met with the president beforehand, and he said, listen, look, he wanted to basically make nice with Erdogan. And he said, look, why would we want to drive Turkey into the arms of Russia? We want them to be our friends and not Russia's friends. I understand that point. That point is real. Trump is very focused on that point. I think Erdogan looked to Trump and said, well, how come, isn't Congress just like Parliament? Parliament, they do whatever I tell them to, so isn't it the same situation for you? I think that was sort of Erdogan's assumption, that Trump could do whatever he wanted and that the rest of us would just happily fall in line. What I thought was so valuable about the Oval meeting with Erdogan is he got a very clear picture that the five of us in the room had strong positions and were not going to roll over. And I think it ended up helping President Trump. I mean, I think he was just kind of saying, look, this is what I got to deal with.
Yeah.
And so if you want to deal with America, you've got to understand. So Erdogan, I think, is thinking, well, let's take the S-400 F-35 issue. I think Erdogan's thinking, well, I can negotiate to do both. I told Erdogan flat out, you will never get the F-35 if you keep the S-400. And I'll tell you right now, if we voted in the Senate, we would get over 90 senators voting to stop the F-35. We might get 100, but we'd easily get over 90. I hope and believe that hearing that from leaders in the Senate may have strengthened the administration's hand to then negotiate with Turkey.
All right, we're in your office, and I'm looking at a picture of Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate. Obviously, you believe in peace through strength.
Yes.
I guess my question, that in that meeting, was that a position of America at its strength? Hadn't Turkey gotten much of what it already wanted by that time that meeting occurred, the president having a phone call and allowing, moving troops away from the northern Kurdish parts of Syria?
No, I don't think so. On the issue of the S-400, I think that's still in flux. And I can tell you a lot of the meeting discussed proposals from Secretary Pompeo was in the meeting with us, the National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien was in the meeting with us, and they were trying to negotiate a deal with Turkey that would involve their getting rid of the Russian S-400 system. That's what we were pressing for. We haven't gotten that accomplished yet, but I think that meeting made a real step in that direction.
Last question on this, and then we can move to impeachment. You were critical, and I think rightfully so, of President Obama's red line. It made some allies in the region question whether they can trust America. After seeing, and I've talked to more than not nobody, some ambassadors in the region. After what occurred with Turkey and the United States and the Kurds, how would you explain, if you were in a position to try to get an ally on board in the Middle East to do something, that they could trust America not to abandon them?
So let me break it down on a couple of issues. Let me start at a higher level of generality, and then I'll get to your specific question. But let's start with what should guide U.S. foreign policy. And I've spent a great deal of time articulating a vision of foreign policy where I describe myself as a non-interventionist hawk.
Right.
Which is the two typical points in Republican foreign policy positions. You have on the one side interventionism, eager to use the military, eager to try to transform foreign countries into democratic utopias. You have on the other side isolationism, eager to withdraw from the world and just stay hunkered down on our own shores. I think both views are wrong, and I have for a long time described my views as the third point on the triangle.
Right.
that the touchstone of all U.S. foreign policy decisions should be the vital national security interest of America. That means when our national security is threatened, when the lives of Americans are at risk, we should be vigorous and strong and willing to use the force and fury and might of the military to keep America safe. But it's not our job to nation build. It's not our job to try to turn foreign countries into Switzerland. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Middle East, there are a lot of politicians in Washington who are vested in saying, we've got to protect every line of every country. I've heard people say, we have an interest in a unified Iraq. Why do we have an interest in that? Why do we care whether a unified Iraq? I don't care. I don't see how that affects U.S. national security interests. Now, what we do have an interest is not having radical Islamic terrorists trying to kill us. Mm-hmm. That's a direct interest. So when it comes to, like you asked a minute ago about the border, Syria, Turkey, I don't perceive a direct U.S. interest in where those lines are. As far as I'm concerned, they can bicker about those. They've been bickering about them for thousands of years, and they will bicker about them for thousands of years. But, and I'm going to get to the Kurds as a people, we have been in too many military conflicts in the Middle East. As we were battling ISIS, before that, as we were at war in Iraq, the Kurds heroically made a decision to stand with America, to fight with us against the terrorists. And many of them risked their lives. And I do believe we have an obligation, when allies have fought alongside us, to defend them. It's one of the reasons, actually, why I've called repeatedly for an independent Kurdistan. Mm-hmm. That the Kurds have been some of the most reliable allies we've had, and I think they deserve their own nation, not subject, say, to the governing force of the Iraqi government, but I think that they deserve an independent nation. Given that, I think it would be a profound mistake to sit by silently while the Turkish military or anyone else went in and slaughtered the Kurds. Early on, the president's position that he took on Turkey, I thought was a mistake, and I criticized it. Where things stand now, they seem to have reached an equilibrium. Now, we'll wait to see the facts develop, and if more facts develop that the Kurds are being persecuted and targeted and attacked or murdered, then I think we should speak unequivocally and act. But our focus, the reason we should be standing with the Kurds is because it is in our national security interest that when people are allies of us and fight alongside us and risk their lives to be with us, that we not abandon them.
Is it your understanding from talking to people in the region that the Kurds are now happy with American foreign policy, that they trust us? Or do you think that the effect of what occurred will still reverberate and we'll have trouble finding people to trust us in the way they may have done before?
Look, I don't know. I can tell you one of the things I told Erdogan in the Oval Office. I said, look, I understand you don't like what I'm saying about the Kurds, but I said on one level it should make you very happy because it shows that America is a reliable ally. And the fact that we will stand up for the Kurds also should indicate we will stand up for Turkey when your interests are threatened by Russia or others. And a story I relayed to Erdogan, I said, when Turkey invaded and began attacking the Kurds, I was at that time traveling through Asia. I was in the midst of a tour where we'd gone to Pearl Harbor and Japan and Taiwan and India and Hong Kong. And what I told Erdogan is as I traveled through Asia, over and over again, I was asked by our allies in Asia, why should we trust America to stand with us, to be a friend and ally, if you won't stand with the Kurds? Mm. And I think it was powerful to tell Erdogan that and say, look, there's a reason when we say violent military aggression against the Kurds will not be tolerated, we mean it.
But the Asian allies noticed us abandoning the Kurds.
No, I heard that in Hong Kong, I heard it in Taiwan.
So is this a red line? Is this the equivalent or worse than the red line? I mean, if you're saying that they're already noticing American abandonment of allies.
So when it comes to the red line in Syria, and going back to the sort of big principles we set on foreign policy, I think it was a mistake for Obama to draw that red line. Mm-hmm. And the reason it was a mistake is it wasn't tied to U.S. national security interests. When it came to Syria, I ultimately opposed Obama's proposed military intervention in Syria. When he first suggested it, I tried to keep an open mind. I said, all right, let me listen to the commander-in-chief, lay out why it is in our national security interest, why it keeps Americans safer to engage in military conflict in Syria. And listen, I could have imagined a case the commander-in-chief could have made that would have been persuasive. For example, had President Obama proposed, had the president laid out intel that Bashar Assad's chemical weapons, that there was a real risk those weapons would be used against Americans, and had the president laid out a plan to go in and either seize those weapons or destroy them, I could imagine that being in our national security interest if there was a threat to America and a plan to neutralize that threat. Mm-hmm. That's not what the president proposed. What the president proposed instead, Obama, they vacillated between points of incoherence. At one point, John Kerry said that they were proposing an unbelievably small attack, which would have no meaningful effect at all. On the other side, the question I asked over and over again in both classified settings and public settings, I said, look, Bashar Assad is a monster. He's slaughtered hundreds of thousands of his own people. But if we attack and topple Assad, who takes over next? And how do we stop the chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction from falling into the hands of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, al-Nusra, of other radical Islamic terrorists? The Obama administration could give no coherent answer to that. And so I wasn't interested in toppling one dictator only to hand the country over to people who would be even worse enemies of America. And so that's why I opposed military intervention, because I didn't believe intervention.
The red line itself, you believe, was an error because America's word to not follow through.
Yes, but I think the mistake was drawing the red line.
Right.
The red line wasn't tied to our national security, but yes, then it made the president look weak when he didn't defend the red line.
Let's go to impeachment. Let me start here. Was there any moment after the Ukraine transcript between President Obama and President Trump and President Zelensky was released that you talked to either Jeff Rowe or any of your political staffers about the logistics of entering the Republican primary in a short span?
No. It's a good try, but no.
You seem to be defending the president on impeachment, at least critical of the process. But let me just try to seek some clarity. Do you think it is okay for an American president to ask countries to investigate an American citizen, much less the son of a political ally, but even if it wasn't a political opponent, is it okay for the president to ask foreign leaders to have their governments investigate American citizens?
I think it is inherently within the authority of a president, within the authority of the Department of Justice, to investigate corruption. And when we investigate corruption, we investigate often with our allies, with other countries, if corruption is international corruption.
But Senator, I mean, in this case, Burisma stood for Joe Biden's son. I mean, that's why the president seemed interested in it. Or do you not believe that fact matter?
So, investigating corruption, I don't think you get a pass on corruption if you're related to a politician.
But you don't see a problem with the president directing a foreign leader to investigate?
One of the most significant problems of the Obama administration was the deep politicization of law enforcement, of DOJ, of the FBI, of intelligence, the weaponization of law enforcement against Obama's political enemies, things like having the IRS target citizens for their First Amendment speech. And,
that's a good one to start. I mean, I covered that a little bit, and I think more investigation probably should have been done, but there was no call, or no one could point to President Obama or anyone close around him directing the IRS to investigate political opponents. Whereas in this case,
Obama didn't have to direct it personally. He simply put in place political hacks who were willing to pervert the administration of justice. You know, the irony is.
So do you see this as
the
similar?
irony is Richard Nixon. One of the reasons he was ultimately forced to resign is he had asked the IRS to target his political opponents. By the way, the IRS refused to do it, so the IRS didn't do it.
Should you not be able to do that? You're saying that's wrong.
You should not abuse law enforcement for politics. But hold on.
But asking a foreign country to investigate, is that different in your mind?
We should be able to investigate corruption. Law enforcement should be irrespective of politics, which means you shouldn't give them a pass either. If you look at the evidence of corruption in Ukraine, I think it is serious and on its face deeply concerning. Number one, Hunter Biden was paid, the numbers vary, but the one I've seen most common is $83,000 a month.
No debate here.
Hold on, let's talk about the facts. If there's no debate, let's actually talk about what the facts
are.
No
debate that Hunter Biden was engaging in kind of skeezy behavior.
But for your listeners, it's worth actually pausing and looking at, he's being paid $83,000 a month. That's $1 million a year. To put that in context, a director of ExxonMobil is paid $110,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So Hunter Biden was paid roughly 10 times what a director of ExxonMobil is. Now, as far as I know, Hunter Biden had no oil and gas experience whatsoever. Look, I'm from Houston. I know a lot of people who are on the boards of natural gas companies. Mm-hmm. They tend to be geologists. They tend to be geophysicists. They tend to know something about oil and gas.
Got the job because of his name. Very, very clear.
It ain't complicated that if his name was Hunter Smith,
but
nobody would have given him $1 million.
I guess my question is it appropriate for the president to direct a foreign country, which we're saying is corrupt, to direct an investigation on an American citizen?
We do it all the time. Of course, there are investigations. Department of Justice works with foreign governments all over the place. When you're dealing with international corruption, yes, we work with foreign governments to investigate Americans who are committing crimes. Like DOJ today, I promise you, I don't even know who, but I promise you today, the Department of Justice is talking with some foreign government somewhere about some crime that occurred that crossed borders. And in this instance, it wasn't just
it's the president.
The question
is whether the president should be directed.
It wasn't just that Hunter Biden was paid this money. You also have Joe Biden, as the vice president, on video, bragging about how he told the president of Ukraine he was going to hold hostage $1 billion in foreign aid.
Right. But that was widely agreed upon.
Until he fired the prosecutor who was potentially prosecuting the company on whose board Hunter Biden sat. That is, now look, here's my point.
Question: is it okay? Do you think it's the president's job to be the one directing kind of specific companies, specific people? Do you find if a future president did that, that's fine?
I think it is okay for a president to support investigating corruption. And when you're dealing with a pattern coming out of the previous administration where cronies were protected politically, I think it is absolutely appropriate. I'll tell you, as I travel the state of Texas, I do town halls, I listen to Texans all the time. One of the most common questions you get from people outside of Washington is, why is nobody being held accountable? Why is nobody being prosecuted? We took testimony yesterday from the Inspector General about an FBI lawyer created fraudulent evidence, who doctored evidence. Yeah. If that lawyer is not prosecuted, there's something profoundly wrong.
I agree. That was hard.
With our justice system. And
can I flip it on its head, though?
Hold on a second. The American people are frustrated because they believe the Obama administration politicized the administration of justice. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think the administration of justice should be partisan on the other side. I don't think it should be a Republican Department of Justice or FBI, but I think the president has full authority if there is credible and meaningful evidence that there is corruption in a foreign country that is not being investigated or that's being covered up. I think the president has full authority to say, investigate that.
So let me flip it on its head a little bit. NBC reported that John Bolton, after he left the White House, in one of his private speeches, said he thought some of the decisions that President Trump made in Turkey were based on personal and financial interests. If a future Democratic president asked the government of Turkey to investigate President Trump or his children's business practices there, totally fine?
Let me say, first of all, I have no idea what John Bolton may or may not have said in private speeches that haven't been reported. And that
It has been reported on.
They've been reported second and third hand, but no one's actually
Right.
no one knows if that's reliable or
True.
not or what he said. So I'm not going to comment on private speeches that I haven't heard and nobody else has.
But it'd be okay for a future president if he, had reason to believe, if John Bolton he testified publicly to ask the, President Erdogan to investigate the Trumps.
If there is real evidence of corruption, then a president is within his or her authority to investigate that corruption. Now, I also said, you brought up the Chris Hayes podcast. I was asked about the Ukraine thing there, and I said, listen, I read the transcript of the phone call. I wish the president hadn't said that. And the reason I wish that, look, in law there's a concept, as you know, that is an appearance of impropriety. And that doesn't mean it's illegal, but creating an appearance, I wish he had not asked to do that precisely because in doing that, you allow political opponents to do the entire political circus we've seen the last several months. I'm sure if the president could go back and change what was said on that call, he would, but there's a difference between saying something that's ill-advised and violating the law or saying something that's not within your authority. And the House Democrats have now implicitly admitted that they don't have evidence the president broke any laws. This is, at this point, a political charade rather than a constitutional endeavor to demonstrate high crimes or misdemeanors, which is what the constitutional standard is.
Let me ask you, what would change your mind? It seems like the Democrats truncated their impeachment hearing. They didn't try to get Mulvaney or they didn't spend the time necessary to go through the courts to get Mulvaney and Bolton to testify. But if they were to testify and say what the Democrats are alleging, that yes, in fact, they heard the president personally tell them that he either wants to hold up the Ukraine aid or that he demands that a statement about Burisma and the Bidens are made in order to help Ukraine. Would that be sufficient grounds for any type of impeachment in your mind?
So let me say, number one, I'm not going to go down the road of all sorts of hypotheticals.
It's not hypothetical. Because
it is a hypothetical. You're saying, imagine this happened and it didn't happen. That's the definition of a hypothetical.
But we don't know. That's what the Democrats are alleging. That's what some witnesses are suggesting.
They're making it up. I mean,
but we haven't heard from the people that might be in the room: Giuliani, Mulvaney, and Bolton.
So let's put this in context. Let's rewind 3-4 weeks. 3-4 weeks ago, you noticed every Democrat in the House began almost instantaneously using the word bribery. They were all saying bribery, bribery, bribery. The reason for that, as you know, is the DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Committee, polled the issue, did some focus groups, and they discovered bribery is really bad. Like when the American people heard bribery, they reacted badly to it because they don't like bribery. And so you saw every Democrat in the House all calling it bribery because that's what their polling showed worked. Here's the problem. The actual evidence that they produced in their hearing didn't demonstrate bribery. They couldn't prove bribery. And so this weekend was an incredible retreat. This weekend, the House Democrats put out this 55-page memo. They called it a scholarly memo, in which they argued that to impeach, you don't have to prove any criminal violation. You don't have to prove any violation of any law whatsoever. Literally, you don't have to prove that the president got a speeding ticket.
Can I ask you, what crime would if Nixon, I don't know, you would know this, if Nixon, as he did, directed the IRS to look into his political opponents, what crime would that be?
So let me separate this, and I'll say, listen, I'm not a scholar of the Nixon impeachment, so I.
But it's not a clear crime. You can't. It's not a crime that comes up.
Nixon was facing prosecution for multiple felonies.
Right.
And,
but you said that the IRS, if he directed the IRS, that should be an impeachable offense. I think we said that.
What I said is that was one of the issues that led to his resignation.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the constitutional standards for impeachment, the Constitution provides that the president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the phrase. What the House has tried to redefine it is they say you don't have to have any criminal violation, any violation of law. We can just impeach, as the new articles they've introduced say, for abuse of power.
But Senator, you see what I'm asking?
If
you can't name a crime for what Nixon did there, but you think it's impeachable, isn't this?
He was the articles of impeachment for Nixon, as I understood it.
But specifically for the IRS,
obstruction of justice, which is a felony.
But specifically for the IRS, for directing the IRS.
As I said, I'm not a scholar of the Nixon impeachment. I don't recall if there were articles of impeachment on that or how they were drafted.
But you think they should be able to be impeached for that?
I'm not going to speculate on. I get that you're trying to get me to walk down all sorts of hypotheticals.
It's not hypothetical.
I'm not interested in walking down hypotheticals.
Parallel.
What I am happy to say is the constitutional standard. If you look at impeachment lies for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and the word other is particularly important because what other means is it means bribery and treason are themselves high crimes and misdemeanors. And there's a basic canon of interpretation in interpreting legal documents that when you have an item in series like that, and the third is a broad catch-all, that it is understood and interpreted to be of the same kind and type as the first two. In other words, high crimes and misdemeanors, which was a term of art from English common law that the framers picked up, was understood to be largely coterminous with serious felonies. Things like perjury, things like obstruction of justice, those are impeachable offenses. But the House's articles of impeachment, they didn't charge the president with perjury. They didn't charge him with bribery. All of them 3 weeks ago were saying bribery, but there's no bribery article. They didn't charge him with obstruction of justice. They instead gave this amorphous count of abuse of power because they can't prove the violation of any federal law whatsoever. And then the second count, it's obstruction, but it's important to know what the obstruction is. It's not obstruction of justice. It's obstruction of Congress. And their second alleged article of impeachment is even more ludicrous than the first because what they're arguing is that when they asked for witnesses to appear from the administration, those witnesses claimed various privileges, claimed executive privilege, and they're saying it is an impeachable offense to claim a privilege. Mm-hmm. And in the case of John Bolton actually went to federal court, to federal district court, and asked the court to tell him how he can properly comply with his legal obligations, whether to testify or not. Now, here's a difference between what happened now versus what happened under Nixon. With Nixon, Congress went and litigated in the courts. Remember, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to hand over the Nixon tapes. And actually, when the Supreme Court ordered the White House to hand over the Nixon tapes, the president resigned within days of that order. Here, the House didn't seek to enforce any subpoenas. It didn't go to court. It didn't bother to litigate it. It simply said the administration raising privileges, which may or may not be legitimate, is itself an impeachable offense. Jamie, that is ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. I want to go in a second to the kind of internecine fights within the Republican Party, ideological fights that are happening. Mm-hmm. But just one last question on this. Yeah. I think we kind of got to the nut of most of it. Are you aware of the president asking for any other country to investigate an individual company or person for corruption?
Not that I can think of, not that I know of.
Do you think that's odd in any way, that the only company we know he wants to investigate is one tied to his political rivals?
Look, I will say Ukraine had a long and unfortunate history of corruption. And by the way, I am one of the biggest advocates for Ukraine in the United States Senate. I traveled to Ukraine, went to the Maidan Square where you had protesters standing up for freedom. I think Ukraine wanting to align with the West against Russia is profoundly important geopolitically. ironically enough, Trump's policy has been much more pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia than Obama's. So you've got one of the funny things, Jamie, is seeing suddenly all these Democrats that have discovered Russia is a bad place. And I'm thoroughly amused because for 80 years, the Democratic Party has been apologists for the Soviet Union and Russia. I'm old enough to remember when Barack Obama was debating Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney said, we need to stand up to Russia, and Obama looked at him and said, Mitt, the 80s called, and they want their foreign policy back. I'm old enough to remember when Barack Obama was sitting with Medvedev, and he said, tell Vladimir I'll have more flexibility after the election. I'm old enough to remember Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State writing in her book that the greatest foreign policy victory of her tenure as Secretary of State was the so-called Russia reset, where, remember, she went to Russia with a reset button, said no more of this George W. Bush, we're going to be mean to Russia policy. We're now friends, are going to kiss up to Russia. She had a button, actually with reset, misspelled in Russia. The irony of Democrats suddenly pretending to be Russia hawks is rich. And on the question of Ukraine, look, when I got back from the Maiden Square, I publicly called for the Obama administration to give lethal aid to Ukraine because the Ukrainians, after Russia had invaded Crimea, by the way, Barack Obama was president when Russia invaded Crimea, the Ukrainians wanted to fight against the Russians. They needed lethal aid. I repeatedly called on the Obama administration to give the Ukrainians lethal aid so they could fight to defend themselves. The Obama administration wouldn't do it. They would send them teddy bears and blankets and MREs, but nothing that could actually be used to fight a Russian soldier. What has the Trump administration done? Given them lethal aid, given them Javelin missiles. So on the substance, I promise you a Javelin missile is much more useful to fight off a Russian soldier than is a teddy bear. And so when it comes to foreign policy, I think the substance matters, and so much of the rhetoric right now is in my view, deeply, deeply hypocritical.
Let's go to kind of the internecine war, kind of the ideological war, I think, that's going on within the Republican Party, within the conservative movement. You might be the only, maybe one of two senators I would ask this question thinking that they might have an answer to it. Have you been following the debates between Sohrab Ahmari and David French? I see yes. The answer is yes. Do you have a side? Are you a Frenchist or a Sohrabist?
I'll confess I don't. I'm aware that there is an argument there, but I couldn't tell you what the two sides are.
Yeah.
And look, I'm more engaged in the battle between socialism and free enterprise.
Well, speaking of free enterprise, that's another place I think where there is a debate. A few days ago, Tucker Carlson, for instance, on his show had a segment where he accused hedge fund or private equity guy Paul Singer of harming a town by forcing the merger of Bass Pro Shop and Cabela's. Do you have a side on that type of? Should we be against private equity and hedge funds? Are they destroying the country? That seems to be what one side of this battle in the Republican Party is saying.
So I didn't see the Tucker Carlson show you're referencing, so I don't know about the specifics of it. What I'll say is a couple of things. Listen, I think private equity is perfectly fine and can have a beneficial impact in terms of directing capital to investments that are efficient and profitable and create jobs. And I'm all for an economic system that makes investment capital available to create jobs and increase people's prosperity and increase people's standard of living. That being said, I think far too often government, both Democrats and Republicans, act at the behest of the rich at the expense of working men and women. I think if you look at one of the great divides we have in this country, it's not even Republican versus Democrat. It is career politicians in Washington versus working men and women. So when you're dealing with massive corporations and big business, look, big business is fine with big government. Big business gets in bed with big government. I'll often on college campuses, I'll encounter young people, and a fair number of the young people are Bernie Sanders supporters. If you look in 2016, most college campuses, we had a lot of supporters with my campaign, a lot of supporters with Bernie's campaign. Our strongest demographic was young people. When you would talk to young Bernie supporters, though, one of the things I would frequently say to them is I'd say, I agree with Bernie Sanders. And they'd look at me really puzzled. They'd be like, well, what are you talking about? And I'd say, listen, Bernie says Washington is corrupt. He says that both parties are in on it, Republicans and Democrats. They get in bed with big business and special interests and lobbyists, and they screw the working men and women. I said, you know what, Bernie's absolutely right. That is what is happening in Washington. It is fundamentally corrupt. And I would tell the college kids, I said, look, the only place I disagree with Bernie is the solution. Mm-hmm. If Washington is corrupt, why the hell would you want to give Washington more power? Why would you want to take those same corrupt bureaucrats and put them in charge of more of the economy and more of your life? So when it comes to titans of industry, when it comes to big business and gazillionaires in finance, I think they're fine. I think they can go. Everyone can go try to make a buck, but I don't think that any of them should get special favors from Washington. Mm-hmm. And I think far too often Washington is willing to give special favors at the expense of working men and women.
All right, running up against the clock, Senator. I have 7 more minutes, so I'm going to try to do 3 quick questions before we go to closing questions, which are fun and very quick. Would you accept a Supreme Court nomination from President Trump, or would you prefer to wait to 2024 to run for president?
I'm not interested in serving on the Supreme Court. I respect the court immensely, but it's not the desire of my heart. And the reason is, look, a principled federal judge stays out of political fights and policy fights. If I were ever a federal judge, I would stay out of political and policy fights. Mm-hmm. I don't want to stay out of political and policy fights. I want to be right in the middle of them. I want to be fighting for lower taxes and less regulations and more jobs. I want to be fighting to make this country safer, to rebuild our military, to stand up to our enemies. I want to be fighting on foreign policy. All of these issues, I think there's an incredible need. So I've had multiple very candid and direct conversations with President Trump about this, and I've told him flat out, I am not interested in serving on the court.
Has there ever been a moment where, even if, I think you've said that President sometimes tweets things that you don't like, yeah, but has it ever bleeded over in what you consider a racist tweet? For instance, I'm thinking of when he went after the Squad for telling them to go back to where they're from.
Yeah, look, I have a long-standing rule of thumb, which is I don't comment on tweets, and I'm just gonna stay. I'll talk about policy.
But I think he's talked in speeches about it as well.
You want to talk about tax policy, fine. You want to talk about foreign policy, fine. But there are plenty of pundits on cable TV lighting their hair on fire, and I don't have any interest. I'm not going to defend the indefensible, but I'm also not going to give running play-by-play commentary on everything the president says and tweets.
All right, we'll go to closing questions after this one. I had Tim Alberto on my podcast. I'm not sure you have, maybe you have responded to the quote in his book where you, when you didn't speak at the Republican convention, that you said, history isn't kind to the man who holds Mussolini's jacket. What did you mean by that, if you said that? And do you ever fear by working with Trump that history might look at you like that?
So I haven't read Tim's book. He's a talented reporter, but I haven't read the book. I don't recall ever saying that quote. I don't know if I did or not, but I don't recall saying that. So I can't tell you what I meant because I don't remember saying anything like that.
All right, let's go to closing questions. I think you'll like these. What historical leader do you most admire?
Well, we're sitting in my office. There are 3 busts in my office.
Yes. Churchill.
Ronald Reagan, Winston Churchill, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And I actually think all 3 of them have a lot of similarities. They were strong, visionary leaders. They took on buffeting critics and the world around them, and they changed the world by the strength and clarity of their vision.
Can I ask you, this is not part of my closing question, there's a sword in the corner. Can you explain that?
Sure. When I started practicing law, I joined a small law firm in D.C. called Cooper & Carvin that did constitutional litigation, U.S. Supreme Court litigation, and the motto of the firm was Vincariat Mori, victory or death. And at the firm, they gave every one of the lawyers there a 2-headed broadsword. So that's the sword that I got for practicing law when I first started being a lawyer.
Can you point to 3 books that most shaped your worldview?
Let's see. Atlas Shrugged, I think, was phenomenal and important. Obviously, the Bible. In terms of transformational books, there are a lot of books I've read. I don't know that I would point to another. I like reading biographies. I've read a lot of biographies. Bonhoeffer is a wonderful biography. I've read a lot of Reagan biographies, a couple of my favorites. Ed Meese did one that was just called With Reagan that I think is really good. Actually, Dinesh D'Souza did another one, Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Person. I think both of those are really good. I have read recently Robert Jackson, former U.S. Solicitor General, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, wrote a small book called That Man, which is about FDR. It's a fascinating book. It actually was a monograph that Jackson, I think, had in his closet. It was never published. And each chapter, so that man was the pejorative epithet that sort of the wealthy New Yorkers used to refer to FDR as that man. Yeah. And each chapter in Jackson's book, and Jackson was one of the greatest writers ever to serve on the Supreme Court. So one chapter is that man as economist, that man as statesman, that man as diplomat, and it's a monograph of Jackson's assessment of Roosevelt, FDR firsthand. Fascinating book.
Senator, I have 1 minute, so these are three kind of influence questions if we can get through them very quickly. Is there a writer or are there writers that when you see their byline, you always read their work?
Not really. I read a lot of different things. I read National Review Online. I read Washington Post. I read a lot of Twitter. I tend to read substance more than necessarily any particular writers.
We'll close with this one. Can you name an issue that you think is most undercovered by the press?
Political bias and big tech. Censorship. I think the threat to democracy, it's the most profound threat to democracy we have, and I think most of the press either ignores it or even worse, serves as an apologist for the censorship and bias of Silicon Valley.
Senator, thank you so much for being generous with your time.
It's a pleasure.